The alarm clock screams at 4:30 a.m., just like it has every morning for the past 15 years. Pastor David Matthews rolls out of bed, his body aching from another sleepless night spent wrestling with a decision that could change everything. Downstairs, his wife finds him staring at a resignation letter he's written and rewritten dozens of times. The same letter that thousands of other pastors across America are writing this very morning. David isn't losing his faith. He's losing his will to continue in a profession that was once considered a calling for life. In his desk drawer lies a folder thick with hostile emails from congregants, financial statements showing the church's dwindling resources, and medical bills from stress-related health issues that seem to multiply each month. At 47 years old, this seminary graduate who once dreamed of shepherding souls is seriously considering a career in real estate. He's not alone. In fact, he's part of what researchers are calling the greatest exodus of religious leaders in modern American history. Every month, approximately 2,500 pastors leave their congregations permanently. That's 50 pastors every single day. More than 2 pastors every hour choosing to walk away from pulpits they once believed they'd occupy until their dying breath. To put this in perspective, if pastors were leaving the profession at the same rate as teachers, which we often hear about as a crisis, we'd be losing about 300 pastors monthly. Instead, we're losing 5 times that number. But here's where the story becomes truly staggering. For every pastor who officially resigns, there are 3 more seriously considering it. Survey data from the last 3 years reveals that over 40% of current pastors have contemplated leaving their position within the past 12 months. That means nearly half of America's spiritual leaders are standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a life without the collar. What's driving this mass departure from what was once considered the most stable profession in America? The answer lies in a perfect storm of cultural shifts, financial pressures, and personal battles that would have been unimaginable to the previous generation of clergy. Consider Pastor Sarah Chen, who graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary in 2019 with honors and a heart full of mission. She was assigned to a congregation in rural Nebraska, a community of 800 people where the church had been the cornerstone of social life for over a century. Sarah arrived expecting the challenges that come with rural ministry: limited resources, aging congregations, young people moving to cities. What she didn't expect was to become the lightning rod for America's culture wars. Within 6 months, Sarah found herself fielding angry phone calls about her decision to perform a same-sex marriage ceremony in a neighboring town. She received unsigned letters questioning her qualifications as a female pastor. When she preached about caring for immigrants, referencing biblical teachings about welcoming strangers, 3 families left the church. When she suggested the congregation consider environmental stewardship as part of their Christian duty, she was accused of promoting a liberal agenda. The breaking point came during the pandemic. When Sarah supported mask mandates and moved services online, she was labeled a government sheep by some congregants. When she later supported reopening with safety measures, others accused her of not trusting God enough to protect the faithful. There was literally no position she could take that wouldn't alienate someone. By Christmas of 2021, Sarah was spending more time managing conflict than ministering to souls. She quit in February 2022 and now works as a counselor at a community mental health center. "I went into ministry to help people connect with the divine," she explains. "Instead, I became a referee in fights about politics and personal preferences. I'm still serving people who are struggling, but now I can focus on healing instead of constantly defending myself." Sarah's story illustrates one of the primary factors driving the pastoral exodus: the politicization of faith. Churches that once focused primarily on spiritual matters now find themselves divided along the same partisan lines that split families at Thanksgiving dinner. Pastors, regardless of their personal political beliefs, are expected to take sides on issues ranging from vaccine mandates to voting procedures, from gender identity to economic policy. Dr. Warren Bird, who has studied pastoral retention for over 2 decades, describes the current environment as uniquely toxic. Previous generations of pastors dealt with theological disagreements within their denominations, he explains. Today's pastors are managing congregations where people get their theology from cable news and social media. They're not just pastoring Christians with different interpretations of Scripture. They're pastoring people who live in completely different realities. The statistics bear this out. In surveys conducted between 2020 and 2023, over 60% of pastors reported that political disagreements were a major source of stress in their congregations. More troubling, 35% reported receiving direct threats or hostile confrontations related to their handling of political topics. These aren't just disagreements about worship style or church budgets. These are fundamental conflicts about the nature of truth itself. But politics, devastating as it is, represents only one front in the war that's driving pastors from their pulpits. The financial pressures facing modern clergy would have shocked their predecessors. Take Pastor Michael Rodriguez, who has served 3 different congregations over his 18-year career. His current salary at a mid-sized suburban church is $42,000 annually, less than what many of his congregants earn in 6 months. The church provides a modest housing allowance, but with property values soaring in his area, Michael, his wife, and their 2 children live in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment 30 minutes from the church. Michael's seminary education cost him $85,000 in student loans, which he's still paying off at age 44. When his daughter needed emergency surgery last year, the church's basic health insurance covered only 60% of the costs, leaving the family with $12,000 in medical debt. To make ends meet, Michael works part-time at a local hardware store on his days off and drives for a food delivery service 3 evenings a week. I tell young people who feel called to ministry to seriously consider whether they can afford it, Michael says with a weary smile. I love what I do, but I can't ignore the fact that my daughter's college fund is empty while I'm counseling couples who spend more on their vacations than I make in a year. The financial reality for pastors has shifted dramatically over the past 3 decades. Adjusted for inflation, pastoral salaries have decreased by approximately 18% since 1990, while the cost of seminary education has increased by over 200%. The average pastor now graduates with more debt than many medical students, but earns less than the median household income in most American communities. This economic squeeze is particularly brutal for pastors in smaller congregations. Churches with fewer than 100 members, which represent about 70% of all Protestant churches in America, often struggle to provide their pastors with livable wages. Many of these churches operate on annual budgets smaller than what some families spend on home renovations, forcing pastors to choose between adequate compensation and keeping their churches afloat. The situation becomes even more complex when you consider the unique financial pressures that pastors face. Unlike other professionals, pastors are often expected to maintain a certain standard of appearance and availability without the income to support it. They're expected to attend community events, support local businesses, and maintain an open-door policy for anyone in crisis, regardless of the hour. Many pastors report feeling trapped between the biblical call to sacrificial service and the practical need to provide for their families. But money, while crucial, isn't the only factor crushing the spirits of America's clergy. There's a loneliness epidemic among pastors that's reaching crisis levels, and it's claiming casualties daily. Remember how we opened with Pastor David Matthews, staring at his resignation letter at 4:30 in the morning? David's isolation began gradually, so subtly that he didn't recognize it until it had become overwhelming. As a pastor, he's expected to be available for everyone else's crises, but who does he call when he's struggling? Who comforts the comforter? The pastoral role creates a unique form of professional isolation. Pastors can't confide their doubts to their congregations without undermining their authority. They can't share their personal struggles without becoming gossip fodder. They can't express anger, frustration, or disappointment without being labeled as unfit for ministry. In essence, they're expected to be perpetually wise, always patient, and consistently inspirational, a standard that no human being can maintain indefinitely. Dr. Melissa Thompson, who counsels clergy experiencing burnout, describes the pastoral role as emotionally impossible. She explains, pastors absorb the trauma, grief, anger, and fear of entire communities without having adequate outlets for processing these emotions. They perform weddings while their own marriages struggle. They conduct funerals while battling their own depression. They preach about hope while privately wrestling with despair. The isolation is compounded by the fact that many pastors serve in communities where they're perpetual outsiders. Denominational assignments often place pastors in towns where they have no family connections, no childhood friends, and no history. They're simultaneously the most public figure in the community and the loneliest person in town. Pastor Janet Williams describes it this way: people think they know you because they see you every Sunday, but they only know your professional persona. I can count on one hand the number of people who actually know me as Janet, not Pastor Williams. After 15 years in ministry, I have hundreds of acquaintances and almost no friends. This isolation has real health consequences. Pastors experience depression at twice the rate of the general population. They're more likely to suffer from anxiety disorders, sleep disturbances, and stress-related physical ailments. Perhaps most troubling, suicide rates among clergy have increased by 24% over the past decade, according to preliminary data from the National Center for Health Statistics. Now, you might be wondering where this story is heading, and honestly, before we continue, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you settling in for the evening in New York, grabbing lunch in California, or maybe it's already tomorrow where you are? Drop a comment and let us know. And if you happen to be a pastor or former pastor watching this, we especially want to hear your perspective. Your stories matter. Also, if you're finding this investigation as eye-opening as we hoped, this is Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that shape our world. If these kinds of detailed explorations fascinate you as much as they fascinate us, consider subscribing and maybe even hitting that super thanks button if you're able. It really helps us continue producing these in-depth documentaries. But now let's return to this crisis that's reshaping American Christianity in ways most people never see. The factors we've discussed, political polarization, financial strain, and emotional isolation, would be devastating enough on their own. But they're converging with other pressures that make the pastoral profession almost unsustainable in its current form. Technology, for instance, has revolutionized how congregations expect to interact with their pastors. The smartphone that once represented convenience has become a digital leash, tethering pastors to their congregations 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Pastor Robert Kim describes receiving text messages about church matters at 11 p.m. on Saturdays, Facebook messages during family vacations, and emails marked urgent that turn out to be questions about potluck dinner arrangements. There's an expectation of immediate availability that didn't exist even 10 years ago, Robert explains. People send me messages at midnight and expect responses by morning. I've had congregants become genuinely upset when I didn't reply to non-emergency texts within a few hours. The boundary between work life and personal life has completely disappeared. This technological intrusion is compounded by the fact that modern pastors are expected to be multimedia experts in addition to their traditional roles. They need to manage websites, create social media content, produce podcast-quality sermons, and navigate streaming technology for online services. Many pastors report spending more time managing technology than they do preparing sermons or visiting the sick. The generational divide within congregations adds another layer of complexity. Pastors find themselves ministering to congregations that span 6 decades of cultural change, from silent generation members who prefer traditional hymns and formal liturgy to Generation Z attendees who expect interactive, multimedia experiences. Satisfying these diverse expectations while maintaining theological integrity has become an exercise in constant compromise. Pastor Linda Foster, who has served the same congregation for 12 years, describes the challenge. I have 80-year-old members who want me to preach from the King James Bible, and 25-year-old members who want me to address climate change and social justice. I have families who think contemporary music is too worldly sitting next to families who think traditional hymns are boring. Finding common ground requires constant negotiation, and honestly, it's exhausting. The denomination structures that once provided support and guidance for pastors are also crumbling under modern pressures. Many mainline denominations are experiencing their own crises, with declining membership, financial struggles, and internal conflicts over social issues. The support systems that sustained previous generations of pastors, regular conferences, mentorship programs, guaranteed placements, have weakened significantly. Younger pastors in particular report feeling abandoned by their denominational leadership. Seminary preparation that focused heavily on theology and biblical interpretation often fails to address the practical realities of modern ministry. Conflict resolution, financial management, social media strategy, and mental health maintenance. Many new pastors describe feeling like they were trained to minister in the 1950s but assigned to serve in the 2020s. The pandemic served as an accelerant for all these existing pressures, pushing thousands of pastors past their breaking point. When churches were forced to close their doors in March 2020, pastors suddenly found themselves reinventing their entire ministry model overnight. They became video producers, technical support specialists, and online content creators while simultaneously managing the spiritual and emotional needs of congregations, facing unprecedented uncertainty. Pastor Thomas Anderson describes the pandemic period as ministry in crisis mode. He explains, I went from preaching to 200 people on Sunday to figuring out live streaming technology, conducting Zoom funerals, and trying to maintain community through computer screens. Meanwhile, people were dying, losing jobs, and experiencing mental health crises at rates I'd never seen. The workload tripled while the usual sources of professional satisfaction disappeared. The financial impact of the pandemic was particularly devastating for churches and their pastors. Many congregations saw their giving drop by 30–50% as members faced their own economic hardships. Churches that were already struggling to pay their pastors livable wages were forced to cut compensation further or eliminate positions entirely. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of the pandemic for pastors was how it exposed and intensified the political divisions within their congregations. Decisions about mask mandates, social distancing, and vaccine recommendations became theological battlegrounds. Pastors found themselves losing congregants regardless of their positions, and many reported receiving the harshest criticism of their careers during this period. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who studies religious communities' responses to crisis, notes that the pandemic stripped away a lot of the social niceties that normally keep church conflicts civil. People were stressed, scared, and angry, and pastors became convenient targets for those emotions. Many pastors discovered that years of relationship building could be destroyed by a single decision about worship format. The mental health impact on pastors during this period was severe. A study conducted by the Hartford Institute for Religion Research found that 38% of pastors seriously considered leaving ministry during 2020 and 2021. Emergency counseling services for clergy reported a 300% increase in requests for help during the same period. Yet, even as we catalog these challenges, it's important to understand that the pastoral crisis isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a broader transformation in how Americans relate to institutional religion and spiritual authority. For most of American history, pastors occupied positions of unquestioned moral authority in their communities. They were often among the most educated residents, frequently serving as unofficial counselors, mediators, and community leaders. Their opinions carried weight in civic matters, and their churches served as centers of social life. This traditional model has been steadily eroding for decades, but the pace of change has accelerated dramatically in recent years. Americans are increasingly skeptical of institutional authority in general, and religious authority has not been exempt from this trend. High-profile scandals involving religious leaders have damaged the reputation of clergy across denominations, creating an environment where pastors must constantly prove their credibility rather than assuming it. The rise of individualized spirituality has also changed how people relate to pastoral authority. Many Americans now view themselves as spiritual seekers who can access divine truth directly through personal study, meditation, or online resources. The idea that they need an intermediary, a pastor, to understand or experience the divine has become foreign to many contemporary spiritual seekers. Social media has democratized theological discussion in ways that challenge traditional pastoral authority. Congregants can now access sermons from celebrity pastors worldwide, compare their local pastor's teaching to online influencers, and participate in theological debates with strangers across the globe. The pastor who once served as the primary interpreter of Scripture for their community now competes with thousands of voices accessible through a smartphone. This shift has left many pastors feeling professionally obsolete. Pastor Gloria Martinez describes it this way: people used to come to me with questions about faith, relationships, and life decisions. Now they Google their questions, watch YouTube videos, and join Facebook groups. They often come to me after they've already decided what they think, looking for validation rather than guidance. My role has changed from teacher and counselor to cheerleader and event coordinator. The changing demographics of American Christianity also present challenges that previous generations of pastors never faced. Churches are aging rapidly, with many congregations having median ages above 60. Young families are increasingly absent from pews, leaving pastors to minister to communities with limited futures. The prospect of managing decline rather than growth is psychologically devastating for many clergy who entered ministry expecting to build thriving spiritual communities. Rural churches face particularly severe challenges. As young people leave small towns for urban opportunities, rural congregations shrink to unsustainable sizes. Many rural pastors serve multiple churches simultaneously, driving hundreds of miles each week to minister to congregations of 20 or 30 elderly members. The isolation is profound, the compensation is minimal, and the prospects for growth are virtually non-existent. Urban and suburban churches face different but equally daunting challenges. Competition from megachurches with extensive programming and professional quality worship services has raised expectations for what a church should offer. Small and medium-sized congregations struggle to compete with churches that have multiple pastors, professional musicians, state-of-the-art technology, and comprehensive family programming. The mega-church model itself has created new pressures for pastors. Success is increasingly measured by metrics borrowed from the business world: attendance numbers, budget size, facility expansion, and media reach. Pastors who once focused primarily on spiritual development and pastoral care now find themselves expected to be CEOs, marketing directors, and entertainment coordinators. Pastor Kevin Thompson, who left a growing suburban church after 8 years, explains, "I became more focused on filling seats than filling souls. Board meetings were dominated by discussions about growth strategies and revenue projections. I spent more time analyzing demographic data than I did reading scripture. When I realized I was more stressed about attendance numbers than I was excited about baptisms, I knew something was fundamentally wrong." The pressure to produce measurable results has also changed how pastors approach their core responsibilities. Sermons are increasingly crafted with social media shareability in mind. Pastoral care decisions are influenced by their potential impact on church growth. Even personal relationships within the congregation become strategic considerations rather than natural expressions of Christian community. This business-oriented approach to ministry creates a profound disconnect between the spiritual calling that drew most pastors to their profession and the professional reality they encounter. Many pastors report feeling like they're managing religious corporations rather than shepherding spiritual communities. The seminary system that prepares pastors for ministry has struggled to adapt to these changing realities. Most seminary curricula still focus heavily on theological education, biblical interpretation, and church history. All important subjects, but increasingly inadequate preparation for modern ministry challenges. Young pastors emerge from seminary with extensive knowledge about ancient Greek and Hebrew, comprehensive understanding of theological movements, and deep familiarity with church doctrine. But they often lack training in conflict resolution, financial management, organizational leadership, mental health awareness, and digital communication, skills that are essential for contemporary ministry success. Dr. Rachel Morrison, who teaches at a prominent seminary, acknowledges the disconnect. We're preparing students for the ministry we remember from 30 years ago, not the ministry they'll actually encounter. They graduate with tools for studying scripture, but without skills for managing congregational conflict. They can explain the theological implications of the Nicene Creed, but can't create a sustainable budget or navigate social media. Some seminaries are beginning to address these gaps, incorporating leadership training, counseling courses, and practical ministry skills into their curricula. But change is slow, and many current pastors received their education under the older model that assumed they would serve in stable, hierarchical religious structures that no longer exist. The financial model of seminary education exacerbates these problems. As we mentioned earlier, the cost of seminary has increased dramatically while pastoral salaries have stagnated. Many pastors begin their careers with substantial debt but limited earning potential. This financial pressure forces some pastors to prioritize positions that offer better compensation over positions that might be better fits for their gifts and calling. The debt burden also affects career flexibility. Pastors who might benefit from additional training, sabbatical periods, or transitions to different types of ministry often can't afford to take time away from paid positions. The financial pressure keeps them locked into situations that may be professionally or personally unsustainable. Young adults considering pastoral careers are increasingly aware of these financial realities. Seminary enrollment has declined by over 20% in the past decade, and many potential pastors are choosing alternative careers that allow them to serve their faith communities without the financial and emotional costs of professional ministry. Those who do enter ministry often come with different expectations than previous generations. They're more likely to view pastoral work as one career option among many rather than a lifelong calling. They're more willing to leave ministry if it becomes unsustainable, and they're more likely to maintain backup career plans. This generational shift in attitudes toward ministry creates additional challenges for denominations and congregations. The traditional model assumed that pastors would commit to long-term relationships with their communities, developing deep knowledge of congregational needs and building trust over many years. The newer model, driven partly by necessity, encourages shorter tenures and more frequent transitions. But perhaps the most profound change affecting modern pastors is the transformation in how Americans think about truth, authority, and expertise. In previous eras, pastors benefited from general cultural respect for education, experience, and institutional knowledge. Today, they minister in a culture that increasingly values personal experience over expert knowledge and individual interpretation over institutional authority. This shift is particularly challenging for pastors because their traditional role as interpreters of divine truth assumes that such interpretation requires training, wisdom, and spiritual authority. In a culture that emphasizes personal spiritual experience and individual access to divine truth, the pastoral role becomes unclear and potentially unnecessary. Pastor David Chen, who serves a diverse urban congregation, describes the challenge. I have congregants who believe they have received direct revelation from God that contradicts established theology. They don't see why my seminary education should carry more weight than their personal spiritual experience. How do I provide guidance to people who don't believe they need guidance? The decline in biblical literacy among churchgoers compounds this problem. Many pastors find themselves explaining basic biblical concepts to congregants who consider themselves faithful Christians but have minimal knowledge of Scripture. At the same time, other congregants use isolated biblical verses to support predetermined positions without considering broader theological context. This creates an impossible situation for pastors. They're simultaneously expected to be experts who can answer any theological question and facilitators who respect everyone's personal spiritual journey. They're supposed to provide authoritative teaching while affirming individual spiritual autonomy. They're expected to maintain doctrinal standards while accommodating diverse beliefs within their congregations. The stress of navigating these contradictory expectations has pushed many pastors beyond their emotional and spiritual limits. Dr. James Patterson, who studies clergy mental health, describes the current situation as pastors being set up for failure by unrealistic and contradictory expectations. So where does this leave us? We've painted a picture of a profession under siege, struggling with political polarization, financial pressure, emotional isolation, technological demands, generational conflicts, and changing cultural attitudes toward authority. The statistics we began with, 1,500 pastors leaving monthly, 40% considering departure, begin to make sense when viewed against this comprehensive backdrop of challenges. But this isn't just a story about career dissatisfaction or professional burnout. The pastoral exodus represents a fundamental transformation in American religious life, with implications that extend far beyond church walls. Churches losing pastors often struggle to maintain basic operations. Worship services become irregular, pastoral care disappears, and community programming ends. Many churches are forced to close permanently, ending centuries-old institutions that served as anchors for their communities. Rural areas are particularly vulnerable to this loss. When the local church closes, rural communities often lose their primary gathering place, their main source of social services, and frequently their only professional counselor. The pastor who once officiated at weddings, funerals, and community celebrations is gone, leaving a void that few other institutions can fill. The mental health implications are significant. Pastors have traditionally served as informal counselors for millions of Americans, providing free mental health support to people who couldn't afford professional therapy. As pastors leave and churches close, this informal mental health network disappears, contributing to the broader mental health crisis in many communities. The loss of experienced pastors also affects the quality of spiritual leadership available to remaining congregations. Many of the pastors leaving are seasoned veterans with decades of experience in counseling, teaching, and community leadership. They're being replaced when they're replaced at all by younger, less experienced pastors who must learn on the job without the mentorship that previous generations received. Some communities are experimenting with alternative models of religious leadership. Bivocational pastors who maintain other careers while serving part-time are becoming more common. Shared pastorates, where one pastor serves multiple small congregations, are increasing. Some churches are hiring lay leaders without seminary training to fill pastoral roles. These alternative models may help address the pastoral shortage, but they also represent fundamental changes in how American Christianity operates. The model of the full-time, seminary-trained, professionally dedicated pastor that dominated American religion for over a century is giving way to more flexible, less institutional approaches to spiritual leadership. Technology is also changing how pastoral care is delivered. Online counseling sessions, virtual worship services, and digital community-building tools are allowing some pastors to serve broader geographic areas and maintain connection with former congregants. Some pastors who have left traditional ministry are creating online spiritual communities that transcend denominational and geographic boundaries. But technology, while offering new possibilities, can't fully replace the personal relationships and community connections that have been central to traditional pastoral ministry. The loss of face-to-face spiritual community represents a significant change in how Americans experience and practice their faith. The denominations are responding to the pastoral crisis in various ways. Some are reducing educational requirements for pastoral positions, allowing people with bachelor's degrees to serve as pastors after shorter training periods. Others are increasing financial support for seminary students through scholarships and loan forgiveness programs. Many are developing new support systems for pastors, including counseling services, peer support groups, and sabbatical programs. These efforts may help address some of the factors driving pastors away, but they're working against powerful cultural and economic forces that extend far beyond denominational control. The political polarization affecting churches reflects broader national divisions that show no signs of resolving. The financial pressures facing pastors are part of larger economic trends affecting many professions. The cultural skepticism toward institutional authority is a generational shift that will likely continue regardless of denominational responses. Some observers see the pastoral exodus as part of a necessary reformation of American Christianity. They argue that the traditional model of professional clergy serving institutional churches was never the only way to organize religious life and may not be the best way for contemporary circumstances. In this view, the crisis represents an opportunity for more democratic, community-based, and flexible approaches to spiritual leadership. Others view the pastoral crisis as a catastrophic loss of spiritual infrastructure that will have lasting negative consequences for American society. They point to the essential community functions that pastors and churches have traditionally served and worry about who or what will fill these roles as traditional religious institutions decline. Both perspectives have merit, and the ultimate outcome will likely include elements of both loss and renewal. Some communities will lose essential spiritual and social resources as pastors leave and churches close. Other communities will develop new forms of religious leadership and spiritual community that better serve contemporary needs. What's certain is that the changes we're witnessing represent one of the most significant transformations in American religious life since the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century. The model of professional Christianity that emerged in the 20th century is being replaced by something new, though the final form of that replacement remains unclear. For the pastors themselves, the crisis presents difficult personal choices. Those who stay in ministry must find ways to navigate unprecedented challenges while maintaining their spiritual and emotional health. Those who leave must reconstruct their professional identities and find new ways to serve their calling outside traditional religious structures. Many former pastors report finding meaningful ways to continue their spiritual service in other careers. Some become counselors, social workers, or nonprofit leaders. Others enter education, healthcare, or business while maintaining active roles in their faith communities as lay leaders. Some start their own organizations focused on spiritual development, community service, or social justice. The skills that pastors develop, communication, counseling, leadership, crisis management, and community building, are valuable in many other fields. But the transition is often difficult, requiring former pastors to rebuild professional networks, develop new technical skills, and adjust to very different workplace cultures. Pastor David Matthews, whom we met at the beginning of this story, ultimately decided to stay in ministry, but only after his congregation agreed to significant changes in his working conditions. He now works a 4-day week, has clear boundaries around his availability, and receives counseling support through his denomination. His salary was increased to a livable level, and he was given a genuine sabbatical for the first time in his 15-year career. David's story represents one possible path forward: restructuring pastoral positions to be more sustainable and humane. But such restructuring requires congregations to prioritize their pastors' well-being and to adjust their expectations about pastoral availability and performance. It also requires financial resources that many churches simply don't have. As we conclude this investigation into why pastors are leaving at record rates, it's worth considering what these changes mean for the millions of Americans who still look to churches and pastors for spiritual guidance, community connection, and moral leadership. The transformation of American religious leadership is happening whether we're prepared for it or not. The churches and communities that thrive in this new environment will likely be those that can adapt to changing expectations, support their spiritual leaders effectively, and find new ways to build authentic spiritual community in a complex cultural moment. Those that cling too tightly to models that no longer work may find themselves joining the growing list of closed churches and departed pastors. The pastoral exodus isn't just changing American Christianity, it's revealing truths about American society that extend far beyond religious communities. The same forces driving pastors from their pulpits are affecting teachers, healthcare workers, social workers, and others in caring professions. The same cultural conflicts dividing congregations are splitting communities across the country. The same economic pressures crushing pastoral families are challenging millions of American households. In many ways, the pastoral crisis serves as a canary in the coal mine for broader social challenges that demand our attention and creative solutions. The question isn't just whether American churches will survive the pastoral exodus, but whether American communities can develop new forms of spiritual, social, and emotional support for people navigating an increasingly complex world. Perhaps that's the most important insight from this crisis. The need for pastoral care, for spiritual guidance, community connection, and compassionate leadership hasn't disappeared. It may be more urgent than ever. The challenge is finding sustainable ways to provide that care in a cultural and economic environment that makes traditional pastoral ministry increasingly difficult. The 1,500 pastors who leave their congregations each month aren't just changing careers, they're participating in a fundamental reimagining of how Americans seek and provide spiritual leadership. The final chapter of this story is still being written, and its outcome will shape American religious and social life for generations to come. What remains to be seen is whether the institutions, communities, and individuals involved in this transformation can adapt quickly enough to preserve the essential human connections and spiritual resources that have sustained American communities for centuries, even as the forms of those connections continue to evolve.